This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. I'm recharged and highly caffeinated, so we might even finish this show early. In today's show, we'll take a look at what's next for Portland, Oregon as federal agents are pulled out of the city. Plus, a look inside the high-speed race in vaccine trials. But first, here's what you need to know right now. Tropical storm Isaias is expected to strengthen back up to a Category 1 hurricane as it heads towards the Carolinas. Over the weekend, it hit parts of Florida, bringing with it wind, rain, and a storm surge, and dropped in severity from a hurricane to a tropical storm. Now, Isaias is expected to head northeast, arriving late tonight. Myrtle Beach and Charleston could see storm surges up to 5 feet, threatening flash floods. And on top of all of the typical concerns around hurricanes, this year, shelters are faced with the added challenge of social distancing.
Whether it's labeled a tropical storm or a hurricane, you should take this storm seriously and make sure your family is ready. Shelters will screen people for coronavirus symptoms. If someone has COVID-19 or shows symptoms, they'll be directed to a sheltering option for isolation or medical attention.
Some regions that have been relatively safe from the virus are starting to see outbreaks. White House response team leader Dr. Deborah Birx says that's the result of a country entering a new phase of the pandemic.
I want to be very clear. What we're seeing today is different from March and April. It is extraordinarily widespread. It's into the rural as equal urban areas. And to everybody who lives in a rural area, you are not immune or protected from this virus.
You've heard it before, but we'll say it again. Keep your distance and put your masks on. Not like halfway or on your chin. Russia says it's planning mass vaccinations for the coronavirus by October, but the trial is raising some serious concerns in the medical community. Even though the vaccine has yet to complete a clinical trial, the country's Minister of Health says the Russian regulatory agency is expected to approve it this month. Critics in the US and UK medical communities say it's moving too fast. Russia has yet to release any scientific data on its vaccine testing so far. The World Health Organization has a list of its recognized worldwide trials, but this one isn't on the list. Back in the US, the federal government's Operation Warp Speed was formed to create a working vaccine as soon as possible, but Dr. Anthony Fauci says that day won't come until next year at the earliest. With the need and pressure so high, the medical world is struggling with the right balance between regulation and speed. Protests for racial justice and against police brutality are still going on, but many cities are asking, what's next? What's the best way to capture the momentum from continuing demonstrations and turn it into long-lasting reform? Newsy's Jamal Andrus focuses his lens on Portland now that federal troops have pulled out of the city.
For the first time in several weeks, Portland protesters took to the streets this weekend and were not met by federal officers, tear gas, and rubber bullets. But now that federal forces are headed out of town, Portland protesters say they want accountability.
The reaction is, what can we do to stop this? And not just stop this in Portland, but make sure this doesn't happen to anybody else in the country.
Kelly Simon is an attorney for the ACLU of Oregon and has been in constant contact with protesters and legal observers on the ground in Portland. The ACLU has filed several lawsuits against the Trump administration and local police to protect journalists, medics, and everyday citizens since last month. And Simon says she wants to see these lawsuits to the end.
People shouldn't be afraid of getting shot in the head for declaring that Black Lives Matter. People shouldn't be afraid of driving in their car with their child and having the windows busted in and tear gas shot inside, which has happened to somebody. Nobody deserves to have excessive force used against them to silence their voices, especially voices that are demanding an end to racist police brutality.
The ACLU of Oregon managed to secure temporary restraining orders against federal officers for targeting journalists and against the local police force for live streaming protests. Since federal officers were deployed in Portland, they've made dozens of arrests. But according to the Associated Press, the vast majority of protesters were charged with nonviolent acts. Sheila Betty is a civil rights attorney at Northwestern University's law school and has represented several protesters in police brutality cases.
Generally, what ends up happening in these sorts of cases is the charges often are minor, things like disorderly. and they get dismissed in relative short order. So my part of the legal representation is really kind of picking apart what happens after a protest and identifying the violations, or trying to advocate and use litigation to try to protect protesters from these rights violations before they occur.
Several Portland advocacy organizations and individual protesters filed a civil suit against the Trump administration for violating their civil rights. The lawsuit, brought by the Wall of Moms and others, seeks unspecified damages, but Betty says these kinds of cases can also go a long way to help heal.
A protester in Portland could file a civil rights claim and say to the federal government, you have to explain why you did what you did. And the government has to respond. The government can't not respond. And so that process, I think, is one where people affirms the power that people have to hold these institutions accountable.
Since Oregon Governor Kate Brown announced that federal officers were leaving the city of Portland, protests have largely remained peaceful. Simon from the ACLU says protesters on the ground have always been reacting to aggression, not creating it.
I would like to read the words of Max Smith, one of the activists on the ground in Portland. And Max says this: "We came out here dressed in t-shirts and using hula hoops and stuff. They started gassing us. So we came back with respirators. They started shooting us. So we came back with vests. They started aiming for the head. So we started wearing helmets. And now they call us terrorists. Who's escalating this? It's not us."
While the Department of Homeland Security has not commented on pending litigation, they said in a statement, DHS will remain faithful to its mission to protect federal property and personnel. The department's enhanced presence on the ground will remain for the time being until it determines that the courthouse and other federal property are safe. Jamal Andrus, Newsy, Chicago.
Okay, we're going to pivot, but you got to meet us back here in just a bit to see where we're going with this, jabroni.
Miss getting email that isn't junk? You should know about Newsy's daily newsletter. It's breaking news right to your inbox. Get caught up quick with the best Newsy stories every day. Join us at signup.newsy.com. Be informed, not influenced.
There's an unintended theme in today's trending topics, and it all involves money and even whole businesses changing hands. Here's what we've got. The Rock is trending because
it doesn't matter what you think.
We'll try this again. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is trending because he's among a group of owners who purchased the XFL for $15 million hours before a planned auction. With some sports leagues on their way back, it's clear that there's an appetite for sports during the pandemic, but this upstart professional football league had to power down in the spring because of the threat of the virus. The new buyers are looking to make some media deals before committing to a new season. Microsoft has shown some interest in buying US assets and operations for the highly addictive and now highly controversial app TikTok. The company said so in a statement, saying they also talked to a certain someone who isn't a big fan of the app.
We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok.
TikTok has been in the news a lot lately over concerns from the State Department around what the Beijing-based company is doing with the data it collects from users. And if you know a dad who likes very basic formal wear, maybe check on him today. The company that owns brands including Men's Warehouse and Joseph A. Bank, two stores that kill with affordable men's fashion, is filing for bankruptcy. The company, Tailored Brands, already announced it's looking to close stores and slash $630 million in debt. They joined several other clothing stores clipped by the coronavirus, including Neiman Marcus, J. Crew, and JCPenney. Filing for bankruptcy doesn't mean we'll never see these stores again, but it does mean they're in a whole mess of financial trouble along with a lot of other clothing retailers during this pandemic. The Veep stakes are coming to a close, and Joe Biden, a former vice president, could name his own VP as early as this week. We know that Biden has promised to select a woman as his running mate, and there's pressure for him to select a woman of color. But as Newsy's Alex Miller explains, no one knows the day or the hour a selection will be made, not even the contenders on the shortlist.
If you're a possible vice presidential pick, right now you likely know just as much about who the choice will be as the rest of America.
The thing is, you never really know. Nobody tells you. You know what they're doing to you and talking to you and interviewing you. You really don't know who else they're talking to.
Senator Sherrod Brown, who was one of the final 3 in the running to be Secretary Hillary Clinton's number 2, says in the final days of the 2016 selection process, he had one 5 to 6 hour long interview where he was grilled by 3 people.
It's a long, arduous process.
This time around for the Biden campaign, it's probably very similar.
They're going back and getting, asking one more question about a medical condition that somebody has, or a financial issue, or something involving somebody in the family, or a position they've taken, or something like that.
Professor Joel Goldstein, who has written 2 books on the vice presidency, says Biden's pick is arguably more important than most in recent history.
Both Vice President Biden and President Trump are the 2 oldest people ever to run for president. So whoever's elected is going to be the oldest person elected president in our history.
Biden, who, if elected, will be 78 when he takes office, says he wants to pick someone who will be ready to be president right away. Goldstein says the perceived frontrunners are not always the pick, and Biden is likely weighing many factors to galvanize voters who may be on the fence.
It sends a message to them about the selector, so that the choice of the running mate makes them feel better or worse about the selector, in this case, Vice President Biden, by sort of identifying some of the things that are important to him, how he goes about making decisions, what are the values that he cares about.
African-American voters turned the tide for the former vice president in the Democratic primary, and in light of recent protests against racial inequality, Goldstein says picking a woman of color is an important part of the conversation, but previous tiffs, he says, are not. As voters saw earlier on Biden's note card, his past issues with a contender will not impact his choice. Goldstein says Senator Kamala Harris, for instance,
I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden,
who went after Biden on the first debate stage in 2019, is no different than George H.W. Bush criticizing Ronald Reagan's economic plan as voodoo economics during their primary campaign. Biden also sparred with Barack Obama when they were both vying for the presidency in 2008.
I trust him to make a vice presidential pick that, one, can run the country, and if something happens to the president, it's always the first thing, and second, can help him win the election. And third, Biden knows from his relationship with Obama that the personal chemistry and personal relationship is really important.
In Delaware, Alex Miller, Newsy.
When you're back, we'll take a closer look at some volunteer opportunities that are essential to combating the coronavirus.
As the coronavirus has quickly spread across the world,
A freeze on travel has the potential to reshape why people fly.
This halt in traditional entertainment highlights how viewers and creators are coping together.
healthcare systems in the U.S. will need 3.5 billion masks.
The economic damage looks very different on either side of the Atlantic.
There are only about 117,000 beds nationwide.
When can we get back to normal?
Around 30,000 people are experiencing something that could be game-changing in the fight against COVID-19. That's the number of volunteers in vaccine trials. But if you've ever wondered how people are selected, you're in luck. Newsy's Lindsay Thies is here to shed some light on the process.
Jennifer Haller of Seattle is proud to be the first American to ever get a potential COVID-19 vaccine.
You're looking for ways to help.
In March, she received a low dose of a vaccine developed by the National Institutes of Health and biotech company Moderna. She, like other volunteers, applied for the study online.
A friend of mine posted on Facebook that Kaiser was starting to enroll participants in the vaccine trial, and I thought, well, let's give this a shot. Let's see if there's something that I can do here.
A Newsy poll found 69% of those surveyed would be interested in an FDA-approved coronavirus vaccine. But before getting to that point, many people volunteer for the trial phases. Seattle vaccine tester Neil Browning got an email from a friend.
I just got notified that my healthcare provider, Kaiser Permanente, is offering this registration to see if people are interested in doing the vaccine study for it. Are you interested? I can forward you the email. And so I said, yeah, absolutely.
Volunteers usually get minimal compensation, maybe a few $100. Risks are explained ahead of testing, including in multiple questionnaires and consent forms, and an hour-long face-to-face conversation, researcher Sharon Riddler says.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more regulated, not in a bad way, but there's a lot more oversight than people maybe appreciate.
Riddler is leading a clinical testing site for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine at the University of Pittsburgh. That vaccine is set to begin its own large-scale phase 3 clinical trial in August. Riddler says it's not as simple as giving thousands of people shots the day the study starts. Clinics take time to become activated for a specific study by the FDA and NIH. So, for example, she says while the clinicians at the University of Pittsburgh know they'll need 750 participants, they don't have every volunteer yet.
Each site is coming on board over a period of a few weeks, and then the enrollment will really ramp up over that period of time to the maximum possible with all the sites activated. The regulatory mechanisms, the oversight mechanisms, those are all things that are common across to all clinical trials, really.
In early July, the NIH developed the COVID-19 Prevention Trials Network, or CoVPN, as a central way to organize people interested in being part of a vaccine study. Who is an important factor in these patient pools as well. HHS Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Brett Giroir, told Newsy that researchers also want to examine possible side effects, especially in populations more at risk.
It's very important to have the numbers, but it's very important to have diversity. We want young people, we want elderly people. Very importantly, we want to make sure we have enough women and minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, because vaccines could work differently, better or worse, in different subgroups.
Thousands more volunteers will be needed for other COVID-19 vaccines in the race. Johnson & Johnson is looking toward its own 30,000 patient trial in September and Novavax in October. The goal with all of these studies is to see if significantly fewer vaccinated people contract COVID-19. White House Coronavirus Task Force Coordinator Dr. Deborah Birx tells Newsy ethics panels are already trying to determine who will be the first to get the vaccine once it's approved for widespread use.
Traditionally, they based it on who is most susceptible to illness, and that has always been our first responders, and then who does particularly poorly.
The White House expects a vaccine by the end of this year, but drug makers say early 2021 is more likely. Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
Speaking of one-of-a-kind opportunities, you can join the exclusive In the Loop fan club by hitting us up on Twitter using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop. And no, I'm not worried about sounding thirsty.
The idea of social distancing in a prison is ridiculous.
He's one of 150 inmates to be released early due to COVID-19.
I can be a part of this family.
When you see a ghost forest for the first time, you're struck by how eerie it is. We've got dead trees that mark where the land was 10, 20, 50 years ago. They're the most striking indicator that I know of climate change anywhere on the East Coast.
During protests for racial justice, demonstrators took it upon themselves to remove statues that are reminders of our country's painful history. While many focus on statues dedicated to the Confederacy, some demonstrators thought it was a good time for Christopher Columbus to go too because of his treatment of Native Americans. American history needs to be re-examined. In this next piece, we profile U.S. Representative Deb Haaland, one of the first Native Americans elected to Congress, who recalls the forgotten contributions of indigenous people while highlighting a strange juxtaposition in the nation's capital.
Duhinomet Itzartiwitsa Shuimi Hanu. My name is Deborah Haaland. I'm from the Turquoise Clan and an enrolled member of Laguna Pueblo. There have been many times throughout my life where I've been the only Native woman in the room. I wish to acknowledge that we are on Indian land, and I humbly ask to speak on this important bill. I felt very strongly that we just deserve to have a voice. We're the most diverse Congress in the history of our country right now. The most women, the most diversity And we need diversity in statues also, quite frankly, right? The Chief Standing Bear statue, that's a very new statue. Chief Standing Bear being the Native American who brought a habeas corpus case to the Supreme Court of the United States. They were holding him against his will. And he talked about, if I cut my hand and you cut your hand, we'd bleed the same. In the same regard, Junipero Serra from California, one of the missionary priests who, oh my gosh, essentially jailed thousands and thousands of Indians. So it's a real juxtaposition. I think there are some discrepancies in historical accounts of the relationship between the colonists and later our country's founders and the Native American tribes. Christopher Columbus, he murdered a lot of Indians, but it seemingly shows him as the conqueror that everyone believes he is, without any regard for all of those Native folks who died at his hands. Native Americans didn't become citizens of the United States until 1924. Jim Thorpe, the greatest athlete who ever lived, won gold medals for this country even before he was a citizen of this country. Native Americans have gone through all of these eras of oppression and people making decisions for them. And so I have to work as hard as I can to make it better for people in the future. It's when we don't have a voice, it's when we're not speaking out that the federal government gets things wrong. Native Americans helped to shape the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution because they had sophisticated governments. If I weren't here, if Charisse weren't here, who would be thinking about those things?
That's it for us, gang. Show 41 is in the books. Come on back for more tomorrow. Same time, same place, but don't go anywhere just yet. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.
Every patient was a dollar sign. It wasn't about how well was the treatment done. It was about how much did you make on that treatment.
On a personal basis, I've watched them drilling perfectly healthy teeth.
I do not think I was an aggressive dentist.
Losing your perfectly healthy teeth. How dare you try to do that to me?
We're not really sure that Wall Street is the best place to make medical decisions for us.
Nothing's wrong with making money if you're doing it ethically. Absolutely not.